Hello, and in this episode we're going to look at data migration. So before we do, we're just going to consider what data migration actually is. So there's a couple of things to point out really before we go any further about what data migration actually involves. So it can be used to extract data from your current CRM system, database or Excel systems and import that data into your Charitylog system. So that means you have a seamless process of data that is transferred from one system to the next. So in theory, staff at the front end don't see any interruption to their case notes or case history because their current active clients are available once Charitylog goes live. Also, it makes the reporting systems a lot more easier because you transition from one reporting process to the other and all your data is concurrent with your previous systems. So the second thing is it can take over just your record types, whether they be clients, staff, volunteers, organizations. So it could just take those records in those places where it could just be their name, the address and the contact details of those records, and that's all you might want to migrate. Or it could also include that information as well as the contact or project history for those clients. The other thing that it can also do is it can also import other information such as outcomes, assessments, etc. if they are configured correctly. So you may have risk assessment documents or risk assessment forms, assessment forms, outcomes forms. If they can be extracted in the correct format, you could also set up a receptacle for that data on Charitylog and import and migrate all that information so it matches everything up correctly. Before we do this, we need to consider a few things though really. That is also a chargeable process, so we do have to raise a charge for this. So often it's not worth raising a charge for it because you could migrate this information manually, or you've decided to start from scratch. So you want to start from a clean slate, so you don't want to migrate any information over, or it's not possible at all. So do consider this before you go any further because you might want to work out whether or not it's cost effective to migrate the information manually. And that would just be staff inputting their active caseloads manually after they've had their training, or whether or not we do it for you. So just the three things to consider before you really jump into the data migration. And the first of these is that you need to decide what to migrate. It's a good idea to sort of start thinking about whether or not you're going to migrate all your active clients or just everything, every single client record you've got on your system you're going to migrate over. It's worthwhile to consider your record retention policy and making sure that you are not migrating any records that have already hit that record retention policy and therefore shouldn't be migrated at all. So first thing, put a bit of thought into what you are going to migrate over. The second thing is to plan the migration and allow it time for it, because you do have to allocate certain resources to this process. So allow time, plot it into your timeline and book a slot with us when you're ready, because we have to allocate certain resources internally for the migration process to be done. Very important that planning starts as early as possible. Then you need to check the data when it's been extracted and decide what to do when fields are missing or contain dubious entries. You will notice when you extract your data out, you will have some questionable records, and from that I mean you might have a record with a surname but no first name, you might have an address without a postcode or without a town. You need to decide what happens with those records. If you are unable to validate them as a client record, you may decide to delete them entirely and not migrate over. So somebody needs to make some rules in place to say what is going to get extracted and what we're going to delete and not take over. And the final point is you need to decide a cut-off point, as entry to the current system will have to stop whilst data is being extracted, compiled and migrated to Charitylog. So if you're currently using your CRM system, at some point somebody will need to download all that data. If people are adding data continually to that after the download has been done, that data that's been added afterwards will not be included in the migration. So you just need to consider that. There is often an overlap, and people might be using their current systems and knowingly that data is not going to be included in migration. So just having some consideration of that will help the process. So let's just jump straight in. I'm going to show you an example of what may come out in your current system. Is we may be able to get something that looks a bit like this. So we get a table of data with all our clients in it. So we've got columns for IDs, dates, surnames, first names, addresses, and things like that. And that's what we're able to get out of our current system, because we can get housing type, marital status, phone numbers, and things like that. It's a huge table of data with all identifiable information, with all the fields that we need from our client records, and they're all there. So we've got this big table of data. We may also get contacts, so these are just clients, and then we get contacts. Each line on here is a contact. So the case ID here may line up, and you may have same one case ID but multiple contacts from that individual case. And it is possible to migrate this contact history over as well, if it's appropriate, and if you're also decided to pay for the advanced migration. So when we're ready for this, we can go into our Charitylog system. We can, once the implementation process has started, usually after the day 2, that means all fields can be configured, all projects are set up as well, because we then all have receptacles for that data, because we've created extension databases to include our custom data. That may be just random fields from the client record, or it may be assessments and outcomes that we also want to migrate. They have to be created before you can download your migration spreadsheet, and that means you have now a place to put those. So once that has done, you can go up to the top, go into data migration, okay, into the data migration center, and we've got our 3 columns. We've got the standard and the advanced and the merging. The merging is pretty self-explanatory. That's if you're merging 2 systems together, but we'll focus on the standard and the advanced features. So here we're going to concentrate on the advanced features because that gives us the most level of complexity. The standard would just include the basic fields, names and addresses and things like that. And the advanced, if you just follow that down with your eye, down in the middle column, keep scrolling down, and they can just press download. So we download this once all my relevant extension databases have been created, and that's very important. That opens up a spreadsheet called the data migration spreadsheet. You'll have an orange bar at the top that says enable editing. You need to make sure you click on that. On the first tab, we've got instructions for completion, and that does give you instructions to how to complete it. We're going to concentrate on the organizations and people tab first. Okay, and this is where we're going to put all our client records. So you can see here we've got the column headers for each possible identifiable field from a client record. So the first thing I would suggest you do is delete columns that you do not need, because it makes this spreadsheet a lot easier. You'll see that there are a lot of fields on here and it's quite unwieldy at first. So what I would do is I would dedicate some time to delete the columns that you definitely do not need. And if you're in doubt about any of this, you can go back into your Charitylog system. If you go back into the customize options up here, if you go into customize, and then with the records that you're looking at, mainly the client records, if you go over to the edit fields option, what that will show you is it will show you all active fields on both the general details tab and the personal details tabs. You can see there are all the fields that I have available for my client records. So there is no point me having any other fields that aren't activated because they won't be visible. So have that open and then work my way through the data migration spreadsheet, getting rid of the fields that I don't have and I will never have. So I don't need, for example, GP name, I don't need this one, and I might not need that one. And I can just repeat the process right the way through. It'll take a few minutes to do this, but it's worthwhile doing it properly and slowly and carefully just to make sure you are deleting the correct columns, and we can just get rid of everything that we really don't need. Using the delete options up at the top, I've used the control key on my keyboard to multiple select the columns and I can press delete. Working my way right the way through to the end, again getting rid of the things that I really don't need and keeping what I do. Until you start to notice some columns over on the far right hand side usually saying, is this a, and then it's a question, so it'll be is it a client, is it a refer, and things like that. So this is the column you do need to keep. So if these records are client records, you need to make sure you keep this column because you're going to put a Y in there or a yes, doesn't really matter which way around, and then we can identify that record type as a client. Because on this tab you're going to put in all your staff records, client records, organizations, referrers, professionals, everything is going to go in the same tab, and then these columns here just define what that record is. So is it a funder bid, is it a funder, is it a family, is it an organization, and you can create the according record that you want. If in doubt, if you don't have any of these record types, you can just delete them and leave it as it is. So you right the way across, you've just got all the other record types usually on the last column, so make sure you don't delete those. Once you've done that initial preparation for this, you can then concentrate on each of the column headers and you can concentrate on the data that you have. So if I go back to the extracted data that I have, so this is my clients. The next thing that would probably make sense is to make sure these column headers match with my Charitylog. So I have a column here called client ID, that's come out of my current system, but on the Charitylog migration spreadsheet you'll see that's now called the org person ID. So what you can do is to make it easier, you can copy this, make sure just press Ctrl C on your keyboard or right click and copy, go back to your data and just paste it. So that's now called org person ID. Start date, we don't really want to carry over a start date, so we're just going to delete that column altogether. I now have a column of data called surname, but on the Charitylog migration spreadsheet this is called name. Note the difference between forename and surname. Do not change any of these must remain the same. Okay, so all I'm going to do is going to take name, I'm going to copy that, go back to my data and replace it with name. Title, I'm going to make sure is the same on my migration spreadsheet, and I don't have a title, so I don't need to worry about that. But forename is what we call it, so I'm going to copy that, go to my data, and instead of it being called first name, I can call it forename. And I repeat the process with every single column header that I'm going to migrate until I've made sure that everything is exactly the same using the copy function. So you can see here I've got a column here called town, but on the migration spreadsheet that's called address line for town. So I'm going to copy from that back to my data and make it address line for town. It's very important you do that, because if they don't match, they will not migrate. A couple of things you need to keep an eye on is things like the addresses, and sometimes towns can come out in block capitals maybe, and we don't want to migrate things over in block capitals because it might look a bit weird if you were going to mail merge people to have their addresses in block capitals. If you want to convert all these, what you can do is a simple function in Excel. You can just insert a blank column, just right click and press insert. What you can do is you can do a simple formula. It's just the equals function and then proper, so just type in proper, and you can double click on it once it's available for you, and then you're going to select cell I2, which is this top cell here. So it's I2 and then close your brackets, and you can press return on your keyboard, and that converts that town into its proper name. So it's capitalized the first letter and put everything else in lowercase. And what you can do is you can see there it's gone into a cross at the bottom of the little cell. If you double click there, what it'll do is it'll drag that formula down right the way to the bottom, meaning it's done the same for every single entry, and it looks a lot more neater when you migrate that over. And what you can now do is just copy that and paste that into there. So I would make sure I replace all my titles over here, and then you can start the process of checking your data. So in here you've got a surname which is just the number 1, you've got missing addresses, you've got missing names maybe. You want to just make sure all this data is clean. You've got a lot of data here that's maybe been anonymized. Do you even want to bring that over? So you might want to control click on these rows and delete them entirely because you just don't want to migrate them over. Or you might want to decide what happens to blank or missing entries if they haven't got an address line 1. Do you want to delete that record and not migrate it over? That's a decision you need to make really, but we hopefully have already made those previously. So once you're ready to do that, what you can then do is very carefully copy each of the columns over. So you can just click the column at the top, press Ctrl C on your keyboard, go to my migration spreadsheet, and just paste that into the relevant column. And I can repeat the same again. So I want to do the same for my first name. So right click and copy, and then go to my migration spreadsheet and go to forenames and paste. And if I do that very slowly, very carefully, and very methodically, I've basically made this spreadsheet look almost like this spreadsheet, but I've just made the column headers match. Make sure that you don't sort or filter whilst you're in the process of copying and pasting, because if now I'm copying and pasting this information over, if I started to sort and filter this using these functions here, everything will be out of sync and everything will be out of line. And when you're copying and pasting everything over, you won't be pasting them into the right line. So once you've started that, make sure you just either save it and stop and carry on, but make sure you start copying and pasting before you do any sorting and filtering. So once you've done that, you'll be left with a large table of data, and then you will go over to the right hand side and determine whether or not these are going to be clients, staff or volunteers. That leaves us then with contacts. Contacts is almost the same thing, but I've got a tab down here called contact history, and you can do the similar thing really. You can just copy and paste over from your contacts. Doing the same again, you would change the title of these columns, just like we did on the clients, and then copy and paste them over to the contacts history tab. Again, making sure these column headers are not changed and these are changed on your current spreadsheet. That takes over the contacts. Over on the right hand side, you will now notice I've got field tabs that say SX, and that is an extension database that has been created. So if I wanted to migrate information for things like assessments or outcomes and things like that, I could put over my extension databases into this and put it straight away. So I might have a satisfaction survey. I can now copy and paste all my data over, again using the same principles, just changing the column headers and pasting everything over into here. Client IDs you would take over from the first tab, to making sure that whatever is in here matches with the relevant contacts and clients in the organizations and people's tab. So if I have a record ID of 2004, that's Mr. Smith, and I want to put Mr. Smith's records into the extension database, I would make sure I put client ID 2004 into here, and then make sure that his records go on that line, so that automatically takes over his extension database records. So top tip for this is to make sure you keep saving your progress, and maybe save and make copies of it just in case if you want to revert back to a previous copy. Do it very carefully, do it very methodically, and also maybe want to mark columns when they've been migrated over. So maybe if you want to go back to one of the tabs, and once you've done it, if you've maybe changed the color of that column indicating that that has been migrated in full, so you can just move on to the next one, which makes it a bit more visual if you want to do that. Or vice versa, go back to your data and highlight that in yellow, indicating that that has been copied and pasted, so you don't lose track of what's been copied and pasted, because there may be quite a lot of copying and pasting that you have to do over time. So once you've finished the compilation of your spreadsheet and you've checked the data is correct and accurate, you've done all your cleansing and you're ready to go, you can return to the Data Migration Center and Charitylog just by typing in data and then back into the Data Migration Center to where you originally got the spreadsheet from. And you would go to the advanced or the standard options, you would scroll down, and here you can see the browse icons for either the standard or the advanced. Clicking on the browse options would then connect to your file system on your computer. You would file the folder, and then you would open the folder and then submit the advanced or the standard. That then submits it securely to Charitylog, and then we process the data accordingly, and we make sure we do that on your booked agreed date. So once we've done that, we will then notify you that it is available in your test system, and your test system will be available to you. You can log in and you can make some checks, some random checks of data, maybe checking sort of 1 in 10 client records to make sure they are all correct, checking that the fields are accurate and correct as they should be, and the contact history is transferred over correctly if that's what you've imported. So maybe just take some random samples and check, and then run some random reports just to make sure everything is coming out correctly as well. Once you've done that, you'll give us notification that it will be switched on in your live system, and then you have now migrated your data over. Bear in mind that period of time where staff couldn't input to their old system, but they couldn't also put it into Charitylog as well. You may have an overlap, so staff may have been resorted to using manual records or putting the records somewhere else, or they may have put them into Charitylog because they had to put them somewhere, and then when you migrate them over you may end up with the odd duplicate records. So just prepare for that and let staff know that if they spot any duplicates, they should be merged immediately. Again, any further help and support that you need with this, don't hesitate to contact your implementation consultant or the support team anytime between Monday to Friday 9 to 5. Thank you very much.